It's 2017, and the man who many would call the most powerful drug trafficker in the world has just been extradited to the United States of America. Joaquin El Chapo Guzman has recently been caught for the third time after escaping prison for the second time. But this time, it seems like he's really finished. There's no easy escape from U.S. custody. And if you listen to this podcast and, have eyes and ears, I assume you don't need to know who El Chapo is and how powerful he was. With him locked up, the most powerful cartel in Mexico and the world likely, the Sinaloa Cartel, is supposedly without its leader. In the aftermath of his capture and extradition, one of El Chapo's lieutenants, his right-hand man, calls a meeting of the top Sinaloa Cartel leaders. This meeting is supposed to include a couple of El Chapo's sons, called El Chapitos, and an elderly cartel leader in his 70s. But on the way to the meeting, El Chapo's sons and this 71-year-old man are ambushed. Chapo's sons are slightly wounded, but everyone survives. It seems his lieutenant is making a play for control of the cartel, and maybe he thinks that Chapo's kids, who grew up rich and spoiled, narco princess essentially, and this elderly man are out of their depth and don't have the heart, and he can seize control with Guzman out of the picture. It's one of those things that just happens when a cartel kingpin goes down. But this guy, this lieutenant, he's very, very wrong. And within months, he's arrested by the Mexican authorities, supposedly with the help of those other cartel players. And soon after that, his son flees to the US border to turn himself in fear of his life. And, that's not the usual fear of your life in the cartel wars. If you're willing to cross over into the US and turn yourself in to the austere US justice system, well, who the hell could you even be running from? See, that old man in his 70s who was going to the meeting, his name is Ismael Zambada. And most people say he, not Chapo, is the most powerful, smartest, sharpest, ruthless drug trafficker cartel kingpin that Mexico has ever known. This is the Underworld Podcast. Welcome back to another episode of the Underworld Podcast, the audio experience where longtime journalists who have reported all over the world take you on a guided journey of people, places, and things having to do with international organized crime. I'm Danny Gold. I'm joined by Sean Williams, and this is his cue to make a reference or talk about something in New Zealand that no one else understands.
Okay, what's going on for me? Nah, nothing really. I mean, my conversion to boring sports guy is nearing completion. I spent like an hour comparing shin pads online yesterday? I mean, I always hoped my midlife crisis would involve drugs and casual sex, but turns out it's just playing football with a bunch of hungover Kiwis. So, that's something to aim for, right?
Love it when you decide to share on the podcast. As always, support our sponsors, support us at patreon.com/underworldpodcast or on iTunes or Spotify for bonus material for a couple dollars a month. Send us money or contraband, and I don't know, if you work for a cool company, give us stuff for free. Sean, how are things?
Yeah.
I'm just kidding. Nobody wants to hear us talk about our lives. When we have a fresh new episode about cartels and the men who love them and participate in them, lead them, whatever. El Mayo, we've wanted to do an episode on him forever. My brother's actually been telling me to do one on him. There's not a lot of info on him out there though, and I'm lazy. So I told him to do most of the research, and he did. He also says that he will argue about the episode with anyone in the YouTube comments. Just post your sources, and it better not be Narcos Mexico, the TV show, or a Reddit post. His rules, not mine.
Yeah. I mean, doesn't that rule out almost everyone?
I don't know, man. If people want to argue in the comments, go for it. It's good for the algorithm.
Yeah.
There are, once again, a lot of conflicting sources and even conflicting testimony from witnesses when they're on trial or when, narcos are on trial or some of the narcos come forward to do state's evidence. But so he's a hard guy to parse. He's not like El Chapo or any of these other guys whose life stories are known. And you'll see, I think that that's a concerted effort by him not to, be the center of narco corridos or just have his life story be told. Sometimes two sources will say an event took place in 2008. Two other sources will say the same event took place in 2009. Just calm down about it, you nerds. We're having fun here. And this is like kind of, I talked about how in the Boris episode, right? So much information when it comes to underworld stuff like this is flexible, made up, exaggerated, just all that sort of stuff.
Yeah, it's useful if we're writing a script on short notice. Yeah, how long did this one take?
I don't know, man. So Ismael Zambada Garcia, aka El Mayo, is born in 1948 in a very small town an hour outside of Culiacan, the capital of the Mexican state of Sinaloa, and just an infamous narco region. He grows up dirt poor in a farmer's family, again, as many of the eventual powerful narcos do. He does odd jobs for money, like washing trucks and stuff like that, and he gets his start in the underworld, operating as a hitman in the Juarez region. There isn't that much about El Mayo in his youth, so it's pretty bare bones. I assume he probably got his start, doing the usual lookout stuff or in the fields, but that's kind of, what we know about him, where he gets a start. And I think that's deliberate. He really adheres to the stay out of the news, stay out of the headlines, keep his information quiet, like a VPN for life attitude that we here try to advise all aspiring criminals to aspire to. Now, to start with his origins in the drug trafficking game, we first have to start with a Cuban named Antonio Cruz Vasquez, who is El Mayo's mentor in that whole world. And a lot of this comes from a 1978 Washington Post article. Vasquez is 32 years old when Castro takes over, and he's a captain in the Cuban National Police when the new regime comes to power. He eventually vanishes from Cuba in what the Post describes as mysterious circumstances. And to quote the Post here, according to reports obtained by U.S. law enforcement officials, Cruz Vasquez turned up in Nicaragua, where some said he was working for U.S. Central Intelligence Agency, and others claimed he was representing Cuban Army intelligence. When Nevada narcotics officials questioned him about these reports after his arrest last January 28th, Cruz Vasquez declined to discuss them.
No shit. Oh, boys, you got me. Yeah, well done. Fair play. I'll tell you all about the spine. Take up a seat. I've got a story for you.
Yeah, I mean, it makes sense that, he knew before we had to tell him, before this podcast even existed, that keep your mouth shut. We've gone into detail before on like the wild Cuban expat world of spy games and drugs and crime, most notably in our episode about the Cuban crime syndicate known as the Corporation, which was way back. So go back and look into that. And it just makes perfect sense that he's this incredibly shady and shadowy dude who doesn't answer questions, because El Mayo is very similar. And he very well may have picked up that sort of subterfuge lessons from Vasquez. Or, he may not have learned that at all from him. We're just going to speculate wildly over here, like the producers of a crappy Netflix doc series about some conspiracy or serial killer or something like that.
Yeah, I mean, not the crappy Netflix producers who hit us up about doing stuff. We really, really love those guys. Just keep on sending us emails, guys. Especially when you try and get stuff for free. We really love that.
In the 1960s, Vasquez gets a fake birth certificate saying he was born in Puerto Rico. He ends up being arrested 3 times over the next decade, including twice for drug offenses, the last one being for smuggling 600 pounds of weed into the U.S. He's released in 1973, and he moves to Mexico, where he meets and marries Modesta Zambada, who is El Mayo's sister. She's in her 20s, and he's in his 50s at this point. But the Washington Post says it's a match made in heaven, and you know those guys. They are a bunch of perverts, so we'll let it slide.
Does this also mean that in some way El Mayo is a Nepo baby?
I guess somewhat. They say the Zambada family was already involved in the production of drugs at this point, but it didn't really have the means to smuggle it. That's why, El Mayo grew up dirt poor in Sinaloa, and like these other poor farmers in the rural region, they start growing opium and weed, but they just didn't have the capability to traffic it on a big scale. That comes much later on. For the next 4 years, Vasquez takes control, though, and he runs a very sophisticated drug smuggling operation from the outskirts of Culiacan, Sinaloa. Sinaloa, in the neighboring Mexican states of Durango and Chihuahua, they make up a region between them known as the Golden Trial of Mexico. It's an extremely rural area in the northwest of Mexico where, it's mountainous, and a lot of the illegal opium and weed coming into the States, it's coming from that region starting in the 1960s. I think even earlier with the opium, right? Even though it doesn't border the U.S., Sinaloa is also the birthplace of basically every famous Mexican trafficker who starts the original cartels, minus the Gulf Cartel guys.
Yeah, I think that started with, there was Chinese migrants to Mexico kind of ramped up the opium trade, right? In the 20s or something like this. But is this still, I mean, this is showing my bit, but is this still happening? Like, do people still traffic opium out of that golden triangle of Mexico, or is it just the Asian stuff now?
Well, first of all, I think it started, Asian workers, Chinese workers coming over, I think brought it with them and then grew it. And then, some of these cartels got started smuggling alcohol into the US. And then once prohibition ended, they kind of, I think they amped up we've talked about this. I think they amped up the anti-Chinese racism and basically took over violently the opium fields from them. But as far as smuggling opium, I think it's decreased a lot because they make so much more money off the synthetic stuff. So, why do that when you can just make fentanyl? I don't know, though. I assume it's still going on. It's like weed. I think weed's decreased a lot, too, but they're still smuggling it in here and there. Anyway, Vasquez, who, is essentially El Mayo's mentor and who really teaches him how to work in the drug game. He's later busted in Vegas for an $18 million a year retail drug ring, which doesn't sound like that much, but we're talking about, the 70s here? So I think he's doing well for himself. Authorities say at the time, it's one of the biggest retail operations in the state. Fun fact, his lawyer in this drug bust is none other than Oscar Goodman, who is a famed mob attorney turned mayor of Las Vegas. He represented the basis for Joe Pesci's character in Casino. Oh, God, Anthony Spilotro.
Oh, yeah.
Was like one of his most famous clients. And basically every other mobster in Vegas, Oscar Goodman, he represented everyone from like Meyer Lansky, Nicky Scarfo, Lefty Rosenthal at times. I actually recently tried to interview him for another project and he wanted like a cash payment, which is just, classic. His wife, I think, is now the mayor of Vegas or was after him. I don't know if she still is. So he was a 3-term mayor and then his wife became the mayor, which is just, the most Vegas shit ever, right? I think there's actually a podcast out there about him now. I think it's one of the recent seasons of the Las Vegas Mobster podcast. I forget what it's called, but just an absolute legend.
Is Las Vegas corrupt? You're blowing my mind here. This I thought it was a pretty cool place. We also accept cash payments in case you want to keep Patreon stuff off the books, guys. You've got a PO box on Staten Island, right?
I have one in Mamaroneck, actually. But, you can send cash there too.
Nice.
Around this time in 1980, Miguel Angel Felix Gallardo forms the Guadalajara Cartel, which unifies all the different independent Sinaloa traffickers under one branch and basically forms one unified Mexican organization, minus the Gulf Cartel to traffic drugs. They start off selling mostly weed, but soon advance into moving that white stuff for the Colombian cartels.
Wait, white stuff, what's that?
It's what we say to avoid being demonetized.
Okay.
Gallardo, who's, always the visionary, he's quite clever when he makes a deal with the Colombians. He wants to get paid in half product as opposed to a fee per kilo, which leads to, the Mexicans, just their profits skyrocketing and them becoming more powerful eventually than the Colombians, whereas in the past, they were sort of subservient to them. Now they quickly start becoming their equals. But the good times, they do not last when the Guadalajara cartel takes out DEA agent Kike Camarena for taking down one of their massive weed plantations that was rumored to be worth about $8 billion. And there's a theory, obviously out there, that the CIA actually ordered him to be taken out because he was getting too close to revealing working with the cartel, one of Reagan's drug profits to militia army schemes that were very popular in the 80s. I don't know. If you want to go down that rabbit hole, go ahead, but we're not going to focus on that. So Gallardo, he goes on the run, sort of. 2 of his top guys get arrested while he's on the run sometime between 1987 and 1989. He convenes a meeting of the top traffickers in the country at a house in Acapulco. And apparently it's the house that the Shah of Iran, and I'm not talking about Phil Leotardo, but the actual ex-ruler of Iran, used to rent when he was in exile. So it must have been a pretty dope house.
Yeah, today I learned that the Shah of Iran rented an Acapulco frat house while he was on the run. What? This is madness. I didn't even know he was in Mexico. That's on me. But those parties must have been, wild. That guy, I think he liked to lay his hair down, right?
I don't think he was on the run, right? I think he just was in exile.
Yeah.
I don't think they were trying to, or they might have been. I don't know. Here at that meeting, he decides, not the Shah of Iran, but the ex-ruler of Iran, but Gallardo decides he's going to divvy up the territories and responsibilities to various people. The Arellano Felix brothers get Tijuana and form the Tijuana cartel. The Carrillo Fuentes family, led by Amado, aka Lord of the Skies, get Juarez, and they form the Juarez cartel. And finally, the area of Sinaloa goes to El Chapo and El Mayo, and they go on to bring back Hector Palma, who had fallen out of favor with Gallardo, to form the Sinaloa cartel. It's not clear if the Gulf cartel guys were even at the meeting. Some say they were, some people say they weren't. And now Gallardo, he's trying to keep this low profile but he continues overseeing the different groups before he's arrested in 1989 as the walls close in, and then he's officially out of the picture. Now, you might be wondering, what is El Mayo up to at this time, and did he work for the Guadalajara cartel in the 1980s? Isn't this supposed to be El Mayo's episode? Well, it's not exactly clear if he was officially in the Guadalajara cartel or not, but we do know he was at the Narco Summit where they split up the territories, and we do know that he's doing deals with all these guys. But he might have been like a semi-independent operator. It's not clear, as few things are with him. We do know from one of his kids' testimonies when he's later arrested that in 1990, Benjamin Arellano Felix, the top dog for the Tijuana cartel, is his godfather, the kid's godfather at his baptism. And months later at his confirmation, Amado Carrillo Fuentes, the top dog of the Juarez cartel, stood as another godfather. So he obviously worked closely with Amado at the time. And of course, he was a close associate of his Sinaloa co-leader and business partner El Chapo during the Guadalajara days. He just seems like a guy, too, who was, a lot of these guys, there was bad blood or they hated each other. El Mayo seems like he was well-liked and well-respected. And there didn't seem to be a lot of bad blood for him, which, he always had this rep as being smarter than everyone else and knowing how to keep the peace. To quote a Mexican official about El Mayo before he ends up heading the Sinaloa cartel, he learned early on how to hitch his wagon to other bigger organizations.
Actually, throughout this bit, I've been wondering myself how he got his name. Like, did he get it because he likes sunny days, or whether he likes egg whites, or why is he called El Mayo?
I think it's a combination of some of his nicknames or names. I'm not really 100% sure. But what does sunny days or egg whites have to do with it?
Mayo or May.
Oh, right.
Okay.
Yeah. The deal Gallardo works out with all the cartels is simple. You do your own things in your territory, but if you want to use someone else's territory, also known as a plaza, you got to pay them a tax to move stuff through their plaza. And it holds for a time, and these guys are all doing deals with each other peacefully enough, with some minor fighting here and there, but this is the Mexican cartels, so that doesn't last too long. And I never understood that mentality, which again explains why I'm not the head of a cartel currently. But like, if you're all making more money than you know what to do with, like, why do you need to be in charge? Just get along with everyone. Live the good life. Why go to war all the time? But a big thing is, unlike the Juarez, Tijuana, or Gulf cartels, the Sinaloa cartel doesn't have any territory bordering the U.S. So the Sinaloa cartel, and especially El Chapo, they start to encroach on the Tijuana cartel's turf. El Chapo starts building these elaborate tunnels, which he'll become famous for, and he ducks out on taxes he's supposed to be paying to the Tijuana cartel, the Arellano Felix clan. They find out, and they put a bounty on his head in early 1992. Here we have the opening salvo in the Tijuana-Sinaloa cartel war that is brutal when they bring in these California gangbangers, the Arellano Felix brothers, Tijuana cartel, to Mexico, and they're supposed to serve as like the sicarios. They kidnap 6 of Chapo's lieutenants in Tijuana. They torture them. They kill them. Shortly after that, a car bomb explodes outside of one of El Chapo's houses in Culiacan. He strikes back in November of 1992 when 15 of his men dress up as policemen and try to take out 2 of the Arellano Felix brothers at a club when they're at a resort town of Jalisco. For the next 6 months, El Chapo and the Arellano Felix brothers are hunting each other down and their opposing men. El Mayo still remains sort of in the shadows, right? He plays it cool. In May of 1993, after spending a few days going after Chapo in Guadalajara and giving up, a couple of Arellano Felix brothers and a team of hitmen head to the airport to go back to Tijuana. While at the airport, they get word that El Chapo is there as well, and there's this infamous crazy shootout. It's more like a running gun battle in the parking lot. And the Tijuana cartel, thinking they know El Chapo's car, they shoot up a white Mercury, but it's not Chapo who's there, it's a cardinal, the Archbishop of Guadalajara, and he's hit 14 times.
Ouch. I mean, yeah, I was going to make a pun about cardinal sins, but then I could actually hear you groaning as I wrote it down. And I'm doing so well with the jokes so far. So, yeah, I feel I feel like I'll just try and get some gold in before the end of this show then.
But you've had some good ones recently. You can't win them all.
I'm on a roll. Ish.
This would be a big deal in any country, a cardinal getting assassinated in an underworld feud, but it's an even bigger deal in Mexico, where the Catholic Church is so powerful and the fallout is severe. Chapo's captured later that year in Guatemala. The eldest Arellano Felix brothers captured as well. A couple years later, Hector Palm was arrested, leaving El Mayo as the only original one of the three co-founders out of the cartel, in the cartel who was out of prison. Palm was extradited to the U.S. El Chapo bribes basically the entire prison and continues to work with El Mayo atop the Sinaloa Cartel, but El Mayo at this point is firmly in the driver's seat. He stays loyal to Chapo. He doesn't cut him out of the picture. He keeps sending him cash, puts that money as commissary and whatnot, and just, remains like they remain partners in a way.
Yeah, and also it's worth looking at pictures of both of them because they look pretty much identical. These like big black bushy mustaches, a bit like Bob Hoskins' Mario. It's pretty nuts.
They had that cowboy mystique,
Yeah.
A lot of this comes from Malcolm Bates' book, The Last Narco. I think that's how you say his last name, which is ostensibly about El Chapo, but El Mayo obviously plays a huge role in Sinaloa. El Mayo, he's the one who realizes once he's solely in charge when Chapo's locked up that corruption is an incredibly important toolkit for a narco to have. So he assigns the Beltran Leyva brothers, more on them later. For right now, just know that they're key players in the cartel, and El Mayo, he tasked them with buying off the right people. It's even alleged that him and the brothers bribed the then president of Mexico in the late 1990s, but that's never been proven. Mayo, he just comes across in general like a different breed. He's the one who stays out of prison. He's the one who stays out of trouble. A lot of the cartel guys, too, we've covered, they're just real psychopaths who kill for nothing. According to the DEA agents who tracked him, El Mayo really only kills people, when it's the last option for business in like a cold, calculating manner.
Oh, okay. So just a cold, calculated murderer. All good.
Yeah, I mean, that second I said that, I realized how absurd it sounds, but you know what I mean. And whereas many cartel bosses, including El Chapo, just want to flood the American markets with drugs, he always understood supply and demand economics and would use it to his advantage, sometimes slowing down shipments, causing that drought. And while El Chapo would just store a ton of cash all over the country in various villas and stash houses he owned, El Mayo learns how to launder money through dozens of front companies that he eventually brought in his wife and daughters to run as the owners. He has 4 daughters and 4 sons. All of them are involved in the family business. In the late 90s, we get another one of those narco summits where all the heads of the top national cartels, like a sorority house at Arizona State, they go meet up in Puerto Vallarta, minus the Tijuana cartel this time. One of the main motives on the agenda is to discuss the Arellano Felix brothers, who, just to remind you, that's the Tijuana cartel. They've been creating a lot of problems in Tijuana, too many murders. Their bloodlust is bad for everyone. Like we've said, Chapo and them have been beefing. At this point, El Mayo is actually having personal problems with Ramon Arellano Felix, who's the most psychotic of the brothers, and it's over a $20 million debt that Ramon claims El Mayo owes him.
I got 99 problems, but a $20 million feud with a murderous cartel leader ain't one.
Solid reference to a rap song that was popular 15 years ago.
That's where I am.
Yeah. The second big agenda item is the passing of the leader of the Juarez cartel, who's Amado Carrillo, we talked about. He dies during a botched plastic surgery in 1997. He is like, it's not that abnormal for these guys to get work done to try to evade capture or more, but apparently he was doing it for vanity's sake, which, makes it a little worse. The Tijuana and Gulf cartels, they're trying to muscle into Juarez's turf, and El Mayo doesn't like that because he has close ties to the Fuentes family. So he makes an alliance with Amado's brother, who's the new leader of the Juarez cartel, and together they're going to go after the Arellano Felix brothers, the Tijuana cartel. God, you guys are staying up with it, right? Is this getting too confusing?
Let's see. So where are we in the ties between these things now? So like the Tijuana cartel is going to get done by Juarez. And then
Juarez and Sinaloa are teaming up to go after the Tijuana cartel, which is those brothers, the Arellano Felix brothers, who Chapo's had problems with for years, and now El Mayo has some problems with as well.
And then the Gulf cartel are just out on their own at this point.
Yeah.
Cool.
Eventually, they have the Zetas situation and they go to war with Sinaloa, but right now, that's where it stands. And Mayo starts this war by ordering a series of high-profile assassinations, including the murder of the Tijuana police chief, who obviously was on the take. And right away, the war is just completely on. By February of 2002, one of the Arellano Felix brothers, Ramon, tries to take on El Mayo on his home turf of Sinaloa, but the local police, who are in El Mayo's pocket, they end up killing him. He was, like we said, the one with the 20 million who was supposed to be the most psychotic and the leader. A month later, another one of the brothers gets arrested, who's the supposed brains of the family, and the Tijuana cartel is starting to hurt. The Sinaloa cartel and El Mayo, they never officially take Tijuana, but the cartel is severely weakened. 2 other brothers get arrested in 2006, 2008. And finally, to wrap up, the last brother, the eldest one, who was the one who got arrested in 1993 for that shootout that killed the cardinal, he's released a few years later in 2013. He gets killed when he's celebrating his 64th birthday. He's killed by a clown assassin,
Oh my God.
which is not a technical term. It's a guy who's dressed like an actual birthday clown with a red nose and stuff who takes him out at his birthday, which, tough way to go.
Yeah, I mean, didn't they reverse this? Spoiler alert, but didn't they reverse this for that Netflix show? Like the clown got shot dead, I think, at the end of the show.
I don't remember exactly, but the show does seem to be relatively accurate with all these alliances and families and fighting them.
Oh, was that the end of 000? Maybe I'm getting my shows mixed up now. Maybe that was another show. God, there's so many narco shows out there.
And we still haven't been paid for any of them, huh? Like, what is going on here? We're just failing miserably at this. This is the whole point of this podcast. With the fall...
That's the spirit.
Yeah. With the fall of the Tijuana cartel, new opportunities for El Mayo. The family had been an important connect between the Mexican cartels and the Colombian cartels. And the Colombians, they're tired of dealing with them at this point. So they seek out El Mayo, who, like we said, has a solid reputation as a top trafficker and just guy who gets deals done. And he is able to secure his own sort of partnership with the Colombians, which is going to be huge. He gets these independent ties to them, which he still maintains to this day. So yeah, early spoiler alert, he's still free, still alive. Two very important things that most traffickers, we can't say the same for them, Just to step back a little at this point too, they're basically partners, El Mayo and El Chapo. So we need to tell the story just a little bit about El Chapo. He escapes prison in 2001, welcomed back into the Sinaloa Cartel fold by El Mayo. Like we said, loyal guy. This is the start of the myth of El Chapo really building in the Mexican media, and I guess the international media too, a little later on. It's already gotten some legs with all these stories coming out of him living like a king in prison. This stuff's being reported in the media, but he now achieves this legendary outlaw status, and, Mexicans love their legendary outlaws, though I guess we all love our legendary outlaws, right? He becomes not only the face of the Sinaloa Cartel, but soon the face of cartels in general in the press in Mexico and in the international press, which is kind of perfect for El Mayo, who likes to operate in the background, right? Some people think he actually may have orchestrated the whole legend of El Chapo thing. He's about that more rich than famous life, you know what I'm saying?
Yeah, I mean, that would be a genius move for him, a bit like what I've done with you in this podcast, right? So I can make no money in the shadows and you can make no money in the limelight.
Yeah. What's the thing from, I feel like I've referenced this before, what's the band in New Zealand?
The Fly the Conchords.
Like, it's a story of, when they're like, this is a story of two guys who start at the bottom and continue at the bottom and end up at the bottom. You're the second most famous thing to come out of New Zealand besides them, right?
Oh, I know. And everyone here knows it too.
Yeah. While the DEA and the U.S. government definitely know about El Mayo at this point, it's much better to be the guy not in the media. Again, much better to be the guy not in the media or on Instagram. I can't stress that enough. But still, with El Mayo's rising status in the underworld comes even more attention from the U.S. government. President Bush designates him a tier 1 drug kingpin, which means the U.S. starts to target him directly. His money, too, which is a huge problem. The DEA focuses on his business efforts. They put more offices in Arizona, which is where a lot of their drugs are coming through. They closely monitor some of his relatives who are in the States, and they raid some of his homes in Sonora, Mexico. They even put El Mayo wanted billboards on the highway between Tucson and Phoenix. At this point, the DEA isn't quite sure who exactly is in charge of the Sinaloa cartel and starts focusing more on El Mayo. Right about that time, DEA officers start receiving anonymous calls that El Mayo was not the guy they wanted, that the top dog was really El Chapo. And I'm going to go out on a limb here and say that was probably El Mayo's people saying, don't look at me, look at El Chapo. He's the guy you want. But according to the Last Narco book, the authorities believed they were always one step behind El Chapo and 2 steps behind El Mayo. I would have guessed 1 step and 3 step, but that's what they said. Although honestly, the phone call thing just seems like, not the most genius level tactics. It's, I don't know. I don't think it's the kind of thing, maybe it is the kind of thing like a dumbass who skims through Sun Tzu decides to do, The DEA themselves conclude that the 2 narcos are just best buds who work together, and that El Chapo even looks up to El Mayo, who I think is maybe 10 years older and probably more experienced at that point. Whereas El Chapo is always on the move and making big moves, They think El Mayo is always behind the scenes pulling the strings, making deals, and trying to keep the peace as much as possible. To quote the last narco, quote, one DEA agent likens him to a chairman of the board who operates solely from the top floor and made the executive decisions. El Mayo knew what to do with the money, and he knew how to handle the Colombians. He also knew what was good for business. He was the guy who wants to cooperate and bring people together, the DEA believed.
Yeah, that podcast analogy's still checking out.
I feel like I've explained this before about the Sinaloa Cartel, but they're different than the other cartels, right? They're not a hierarchical top-down structure with one boss, like say El Mencho and Jalisco. It's been referred to often as the Sinaloa Federation because it's a collection of organizations that are loosely aligned that, might agree on an overall strategy, share drug smuggling routes, share intelligence they get from bribes, things like that. But they also have their own independent routes, their own bribes, their own operatives. So Mayo has his guys, Chapo has his guys, and another powerful leadership crew like the Beltran Leyva brothers. They got their guys as almost completely separate organizations that are also working together. They also all know each other from back in the day in Sinaloa. The Beltran Leyvas grew up down the road from El Chapo's family, and there was a lot of marrying between the organizations because, as the DEA agent said, the thinking might be, that if you're going to be less likely to turn on or kill your amigo if your wife is going to annoy you afterwards, which is just good policy in general. Just to list a few of the marriages, El Chapo's last wife, the one he had when he got busted, the beauty queen, she was the daughter of a top figure in the cartel.
Yeah, Emma Coronel. We got into some cool stuff about her on the show with Deborah Bonello about narcos, or female narcos, I think a few months ago now. Or maybe it's like a year ago. I don't know anymore. But yeah, that was really interesting.
I think it was like a year ago. Time's a flat circle.
Yeah.
One of the Beltran Leyva brothers was married to El Chapo's cousin. One of El Mayo's sons was married to the daughter of another top Sinaloa cartel figure. And this is a thing that I can't find conclusive proof of, but they say that one of El Mayo's sons is supposedly married to one of El Chapo's daughters, which is, talk about narco royalty right there. Like, that wedding must have been a lot of fun. You guys are geniuses. You get the idea. The funny thing is, though, that still most of them, maybe not El Chapo and El Mayo, or maybe, they still almost always turn on each other, even with that. A lot of angry wives. But yeah, where was I? Chapo, fresh out of prison, he's eager to really get back into the mix of things. And this is where we see the cartel become even more of a federation when Chapo really asserts his independence even more as a distinct separate group. The DEA believes that El Mayo and El Chapo share a common interest to keep the businesses strong and not undermine each other. And even though they had a bunch of disagreements about strategy, they never really broke rank. But the thinking is, at this point, they're operating just more and more independently, sort of like a non-aggression pact with shared resources. So El Chapo then gets into the meth business without El Mayo, which is his first solo drug partnership. He's stepping out on his own, like Sean does to his family for days at a time when he gets into his own meth business, if you know what I'm saying.
An hour online on shin pads.
So we're in 2003. El Chapo is looking to step out on his own, build himself back up, and he goes against El Mayo's wishes for stability for the first time. By this point, the Tijuana cartel has fallen off its peak. El Mayo has a newish alliance with the Juarez cartel, so the Sinaloa cartel has control or options on most of the border. What they don't have control over is the lucrative border town of Nuevo Laredo in eastern Mexico. That is Gulf Cartel territory, but El Chapo senses weakness in the Gulf Cartel at that time. The leader has just gotten arrested a few years earlier, and even though it's been controlled by the same family for decades, it now seems like their territory is pretty much up for grabs. After a ton of infighting, a guy who... Sean, why don't you pronounce this name for us?
Osiel Cardenas Guillen.
Listen to that accent. He takes the reins. El Chapo and the Beltran Leyva brothers, they have a narco summit. Again, these guys love their conferences, right? They're like dentists in Vegas. They decide now is the time to strike. They're going to take over Nuevo Laredo and push the Gulf Cartel out. They think it's going to be an easy takeover, but what they don't account for is the Zetas, which again, you guys know who they are. Lunatic ex-Mexican military special forces guys that the Gulf Cartel had recruited as their armed wing. We have a whole episode on them from only a couple months back. I don't even remember, but good episode. So go listen to that because we go into more detail there.
Yeah, that was a good one. I mean, they are pretty high up on that psychopath test too. Not nice guys, very silly geese.
Yeah, just bad news all around. Bodies, of course, start dropping. Chapo and Belcha and Leyva, they formed their own groups of goons called Los Negros, composed of gangbangers with a lot of Mexican mafia guys from El Salvador and Honduras and, all the local gangs down there. But those guys are just no match for the Zetas, though the war doesn't seem to be going too well, but Chapo catches a double big break, or so he thinks, when Guillen gets arrested by the Mexicans in 2003. So they kind of assume that the Gulf Cartel is finished, but it also helps Chapo out with the Mexican government. The U.S. had been breathing down their neck after he had busted out of prison, but now that they arrested the boss of one of the major cartels, the pressure lowers, and in turn relieves some of their, their need to go after Chapo. He even shows up in Nuevo Laredo a few months later to claim victory in a way, mission accomplished and whatnot. It's a little presumptuous, the mission accomplished thing, because, the Zetas come back on the Sinaloa Cartel with a vengeance, and they lose a lot of people. I think we talked about this too in the little mini episode we did on La Barbie, who was the American-born psychopathic narco guy who was a key player in that war, which is, I think, available on the Patreon or on the YouTube. So while this battling of the Gulf Cartel / Zetas, while that's going on, El Mayo convenes this meeting with El Chapo and the brothers in 2004 in Monterrey, Mexico. So he's got that alliance with the Juarez cartel, I think we mentioned, with El Mayo, Sinaloa Federation, and them. And it's been fruitful. It's taken out the Tijuana cartel. Chapo now wants to take out the current Juarez leader, who is the brother of Amado Carrillo Fuentes, who died on the operating table. If you remember, El Mayo had formed an alliance with him after that death because he was friends with the family. But, like we said, these guys don't stay loyal usually for long. He agrees to it, so El Chapo makes his move when the brother is visiting his family back in Culiacan, and he is killed, and not El Chapo, the brother is killed, and so is his wife. Yeah, so things are going nuts with the Sinaloa Federation and El Mayo and Chapo. They're fighting the Zetas. They're now going to be fighting the Juarez cartel, and this is just the start of it. Things are about to get really bad in Mexico, and El Mayo and Chapo are basically going to be at war against everyone. And that is what we will get into next week. 2013, Sinaloa, Mexico. And El Mayo Zambada, arguably the most powerful drug lord in Mexico, and maybe even the world, is not happy. El Chapo, his longtime friend, longtime business partner, and longtime co-leader of the Sinaloa Cartel, has been uncharacteristically making a lot of mistakes that threaten both of their interests. You see, at the start of their drug trafficking careers, El Mayo and Chapo were on the same page. They were business-oriented, here to make money, not magazine covers. They followed their code. Keep an extremely low profile, try not to be seen unless necessary. They didn't want to end up like so many of the other cartel leaders as the center of attention. Everyone knows where that leads, though sometimes the allure of fame, it can prove to be too much for even the most powerful gangsters. While El Mayo continues to live like that, hiding out in the mountainous region of rural Sinaloa, El Chapo has been out and about the last few years. He's been spending more time in the capital city of Culiacan and at resort beach towns in Mexico enjoying himself. Slipping up, getting too confident, arrogant, one could say. El Mayo is disappointed in his partner and thinks that these activities have led to not only more heat from the authorities on El Chapo, but more heat on himself and the cartel in general. 2,000 miles north, El Mayo's son Vicente, who was once rumored to be next in line for the throne, is in another type of trouble. After being held for years in severe conditions in the U.S., he's starting to crack under DEA pressure. But, he reckons, there's just one last thing to do before he can turn witness against the cartel. El Mayo's phone rings in the middle of the night. The call is coming from a federal prison in Chicago, and it's Vicente on the line. It's a secret call, sure, but the feds are listening, because it's a call made possible by many intermediaries and lawyers and okayed by the U.S. government to remain off the books. Vicente has a message for his father. Dad, they got me, and it's either us or him being El Chapo. El Mayo and Chapo have been fiercely loyal to each other for decades, probably longer than any other drug traffickers who aren't immediate family. But things change quickly when it's you or them. He replies with a simple message. Do what you got to do. And very soon after, the walls start to close in on El Chapo, the most famous drug trafficker since Pablo Escobar, but maybe not the most powerful. Welcome back to yet another episode of the Underworld Podcast and audio experience. Okay, So where were we in the saga of El Mayo Zambada and the infamous El Chapo? They are best buds and also colleagues. Basically, the C-suite executives of the Sinaloa Cartel, Sinaloa Federation, whatever you want to call it. They both have their own guys and own, business interests, but they work in tandem. And they came up together. But there are a couple of big changes on the horizon when we join in with them. I think we're around 2007, 2008. Chapo is branching out, doing his own thing, getting into meth, just like a young Sean Williams. And he's also convinced El Mayo to make a move on his former allies in the Juarez cartel, or at least approve one being made against them.
Okay, so this is your new thing, is it? That I'm a dealer. And yet, as we speak, I'm wearing a t-shirt that I've had since I was at university, which is about 20 years ago, which definitely disproves that theory.
Does it, though? I feel like it kind of fits right into that theory. If you're wearing a 20-year-old t-shirt.
Maybe.
So yeah, Mexico at this time, late 2000s, there's a war going on outside that no man is safe from. Sinaloa is fighting the Zetas over the Nuevo Laredo Plaza. They're the, of course, psychopathic special forces killers. They're actually now going on the offensive. And then in 2007, we get a narco peace summit where the top leaders of the Sinaloa Cartel and the Zetas meet up. Imagine working that as like the caterer, right? It's just got to be terrifying. Just the worst event planning assignment ever. Those guys all gathering in a room.
I mean, I don't know. I've been to plenty of tech conferences, and I would hazard a guess that they are way, way worse, personality and content-wise.
All right, so we're not 100% sure, but we're like 90% sure. Not us, but the people who have written about these things. 90% sure that El Mayo is at this meeting, and a deal is brokered and territory split up to end the war. The Zetas get to keep Nuevo Laredo. Sinaloa keeps Acapulco, and they get some additional territory as well. And the Beltran Leyva brothers are made the point person between Sinaloa and the Zetas to keep the peace. We talked about them last episode. We've talked about them a lot before. They're the brothers who worked with Sinaloa and controlled a lot of their own men, a lot of their own territory. A lot of people in the know attribute this deal to El Mayo basically making it happen. He just has that reputation of peacemaking, negotiating, everything like that. He's the one that could actually bring these warring groups together and have them leave without killing each other. But he's not invincible. And in 2008, his brother El Rey gets arrested in Mexico City. El Rey, which is Spanish for the Rey, is a top lieutenant for the cartel and in charge of the Mexico City airport, which is Mexico's largest.
Yeah, I mean, sometimes when you play football against a really bad team, you say they've brought you down to their level. And I feel like that's what just happened with that joke a little bit there.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like I should have made one last one about like the Mayo, but whatever. So I'm making up for that. But yeah, now that we get that arrest out of the way, we got to strap in because all hell is going to break loose in 2008. 2006, Mexico elects a new president, Felipe Calderón, who wins a really tense, heated campaign in a controversial electoral process. He wins by something like 0.6% of the total votes. There's a recount that takes months to confirm, and a lot of people have questions. But he takes office December 1st, 2006, and within 10 days, declares a war on the cartels. Some people think he may have done it to gain legitimacy after a questionable win, kind of like, JFK moving on the mob. He deploys thousands of troops to Michoacan, the first time army troops have been deployed in Mexico to battle the cartels. By late 2007, things are heating up, and there's tens of thousands of troops deployed. Chapo and Mayo, they want their top people to keep a low profile, but one of the Beltran Leyva brothers, Alfredo, who they call the Fire Ant because of his temper, and how much of a temper do you have to get known for it in the cartel upper echelon? I don't know, but Fire Ant is just kind of like I don't know. I feel like it's like an insulting. Yeah, it's an insulting nickname too. Like Fire Ants are scary, but they're also like they're little guys. So
go honey
maybe
badger. Honey badgers.
I don't know if he liked. Yeah, I don't know. I don't think that whole meme had become a thing back then. So Fire Ants is more fitting, but he is behaving like a young Sean Williams. He's partying it up in Sinaloa, going out to bars, just throwing rangers, just drawing attention to himself, being loud, And just like a young Sean Williams, he is soon arrested by the Mexican army, this time in January of 2008, and his arrest leads to trouble in paradise. There's rumors that Chapo gave him up to save his own skin by doing a secret deal with the Mexican government or to save his son, who had been arrested but was soon released after Fire Ant got popped. There's another rumor that Chapo gave him up because he was beefing with the Beltran Leyva brothers over control of the Flores twins. They were two major distributors in Chicago. I think the biggest ones the Sinaloa Cartel had at that point, maybe even the biggest distributors in the U.S. They eventually got arrested. Years later, they became informants, and then 50 Cent did a podcast about them with them that I feel like it should have been a lot better than it was. I got bored of it. Anyway, interestingly, the Flores twins once claimed that the Beltran Leyva brothers, like their whole group, was trafficking more weight than Chapo and Mayo, which is something to think about because they definitely don't get the attention that those two get. Yeah. Whatever happened, the Beltran Leyvas, they blame Chapo, and it's not the kind of argument that's going to be resolved with like a straightforward apology and a promise to do better.
So do these guys work with like stringers in American cities to distribute, or do they have their own bosses in the cartel, get dispatched across the border? I mean, like, I'm all for freelancers getting more work, but it seems like a pretty risky way to do business if you're getting freelancers in like Chicago, New York, whatever, to spread out all this stuff.
Yeah, I mean, by stringers, you mean like, guys who actually are in the cartel or not. But it's interesting. Yeah. They're a good example of that and how stuff is. I think they definitely have people now. Back then, I wasn't paying too close attention to it, but I think the thing with the Flores twins is that, when you look at the indictments, when you listen to the feds, they're technically in the cartel. They're seen as guys from the Sinaloa Cartel. Uh-huh. I've seen other people say that they're kind of like you said, they're like freelance distributors, right? Who are aligned with them and work with them because obviously they're doing deals with them, but they're not officially in the cartel. And of course, if these guys are, it's like Pee Wee Herman in Blow or whatever the character that he was based on. If these are the guys that are the major distributors that have the network and can get your stuff out there, well, the cartels are all trafficking for themselves, right? They're going to want that guy to be working for them. So that's my assumption of what was going on with the Flores twins at that point. Whether they were technically in the cartel or not, I don't know, man. It's a weird gray area. So much of this stuff is just not, there's not concrete answers for it, right? And you see stuff, you have witnesses, you have informants, you have the DEA, you have the Mexican law enforcement. Everyone seems to have a different spin on how things actually work or who's actually in charge or what actually happens.
Yeah, and everyone's on the take somewhere as well. They've got their own incentive to say something or other.
So the violence at this time in the Sinaloa city of Culiacan especially, I think that's the capital of Sinaloa, right? It gets so out of control. Even the imprisoned brother, the one who was originally, whose arrest started this whole thing, he sends a letter to his other brothers to stop the war saying, Chapo and those guys, they had nothing to do with his arrest. But it doesn't work. And they're also actually at the same time battling out with federal troops, police, all that. Everyone suspects that, whether it's law enforcement, military, they're on their rivals' payroll. So it's a really bloody affair. Meanwhile, in Tijuana, Mayo and Chapo, they're backing up another Sinaloan who is battling the remnants of the Tijuana cartel. And in Juarez, they're also battling the Juarez cartel, which is led by the Carrillo Fuentes family. That was Amato's, family. We talked about him, Lord of the Skies. Mayo had betrayed him. So they're fighting everyone, like all the time. I mean, it just seems like a lot. They got a full plate on their hands. They're taking on 3 or 4 other cartels. But I don't want you guys to get lost in the weeds, even though I know this is super complicated. The basic takeaway is that Sinaloa is impossibly strong at this point, and they've gone to war against everyone, and they're just asserting themselves. In Owen Grillo's El Narco, I think we've interviewed him, 3 times on this podcast, but that book is also fantastic. He says there's 2 reasons for Sinaloa going to war like this. The first is that President Calderon's war on the cartels is actually working. There's record seizures of drugs costing billions of dollars, and the various traffickers, they start getting into fights over plaza payments, taxes, whose fault this shipment was lost, whose fault that one was lost, and just stuff like that. And, there's pressure. And since the Sinaloans, they're not known for taking things lightly, we get bodies starting to drop.
Yeah, a lot of stress. And these guys are bringing up kids at the same time, running a drug cartel, doing crimes, murdering. I mean, they got to find some downtime. Like, their work-life balance is way out of whack.
I think they probably had nannies. I think they assume they had help. They're not toughing it out like you are.
Tough gig for a nanny.
Yeah, there's a second argument, and this one is favored by some Mexican journalists, and actually cartel guys themselves have said that, and that's that the Sinaloa cartel felt so emboldened by their alliance with federal officers and all the other officials they bribed that they decided they were going to take over the entire game. And that, people kind of wanted this, people that were in those positions, because once you have the kingpin, once you have the group that oversees everything, there's a lot less warring over territory. Grillo goes on to say that there's definitely evidence that federal officers were on the Sinaloa cartel payroll and supported their offensive, but there's other officers that were on the rival cartel payrolls, and he buys more into the first argument. At this point, basically every official in Mexico has been accused of taking bribes. And, that point back then, but even now, right?
Yeah.
Especially if they get high up enough in the government, police, army, whatever it is. It's just seen as par for the course. And a lot of them do take bribes. Amayo's brother later testifies that he was giving out $300,000 a month, which doesn't seem like that much if you're bribing a ton of officials. His son says that Mayo was forking over an additional $1 million a month by himself, and that's just them. And the former drug czar of Mexico was found guilty recently in the U.S. for taking bribes from the Sinaloa Cartel. There's a Chapo associate who went on trial in the U.S. who said he bribed the president of Mexico from 2012 to 2018. That's Enrique Peña Nieto with $100 million, which seems like a lot. But all these guys have been accused, and there's a lot of evidence that a lot of them have been doing it.
Yeah, I mean, I guess you're not a real drug czar unless you're on the payroll of the cartel, right? So I guess he's doing his job in some sense. But I mean, even the current president, AMLO, has been accused of taking Sinaloa Cartel bribes for years, going back to even before this bit that you're talking about. I mean, back in 2006, one of his campaign officials is said to have got dirty money from the cartel. So, yeah, it ain't getting any better, any of this stuff, really.
We should get bribes from them. Dude, the business ideas are flowing out of me. Last week it was the trouble tourism sort of stuff to Hmong Law and Burmese casinos. Now, what if we do narco corridos, except they're just podcast episodes that very few people listen to about various cartel guys? They'll pay us to do their.
I mean,
that?
Yeah, that's basically
not.
what loads of singers and rappers do, right? Why can't we do it?
Yes.
We're easily as cool as them. So yeah, let's go for it.
And Peso Pluma does get those death threats. It might not be worth it. But okay, back to the war and all the violence in Sinaloa. It gets so bad the Mexican government allegedly tries to arrange a peace summit between the Beltran Leyva brothers and Chapo at a ranch in Durango. Doesn't take. And then there's another summit in Durango with the heads of every major cartel, or basically what's left of every major cartel. And this finally leads to a temporary peace for about a minute. Then in March 2009, there's a seemingly big blow at El Mayo. His son Vicente, who's not only his heir apparently in the drug game, but also a pretty high-ranking member of the Sinaloa Cartel himself, is arrested in Mexico City by the Attorney General's office on his way back from a meeting with the DEA in a hotel room. There's a theory that he had enough of the cartel life and was looking for a way out, and had actually gotten the blessing of Chapo and Mayo to do it, to cut a deal and just be done with it. There's just, no fortitude in these younger generations. Am I right? There's also a lot of allegations, though, the DA was favoring certain cartels to take control to stop the chaoticness of the all-out war on all these multiple fronts. Leave one all-encompassing cartel in charge, because it cuts down all the various wars over territory, like I just said before. Eventually, he's actually extradited to the U.S.
Chaoticness. Just want to call that out. Chaos?
That's a word. That's a word. Oh yeah, chaos is probably a better way to describe that. Yeah, chaos. There's no shortage though of insiders in Sinaloa who are giving info to the DA and have been, and other law enforcement, but usually they're doing it sort of with the blessing of the higher ups and against their enemies for the most part. In a 2012 article in Newsweek, they interview a former middle manager of the Sinaloa Cartel who talks about how he was instructed by a top Sinaloa operative to give information to the Americans, in this instance against the Juarez cartel. He talks about going to ICE offices, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, to meet with U.S. investigators. And there's a quote from the article: "The agents he met with were very polite. He was surprised by what they had to say. One of the ICE agents said they were here to help the Sinaloa cartel and to fuck the Juarez cartel. Sorry for the language." That's exactly what they said.
I mean, this is starting to sound a bit like the plot of Sicario, or maybe the second Sicario, which actually I saw accidentally dubbed into German at the cinema, and Josh Brolin had a voice like Bart Simpson, which I'm not going to say it ruined the movie. It just was a different experience.
The second one was pretty bad, but the first one was pretty solid,
especially
that scene when they're driving over.
Yeah.
And the dude from Burn Notice just
my God,
wrecks
it's
it.
incredible.
Oh,
yeah, I love that movie.
Yeah. The article goes on to talk about how there was a concerted effort by the Sinaloa Cartel to have lieutenants act as informants to ICE, to DA officials, to every U.S. law enforcement agency they could. And there's an ongoing investigation into how ICE deals with the Sinaloa informants. It also tells the story of a lawyer who was working with the cartel as an advisor to Chapo and was indicted in 1995. He becomes a key informant in exchange for working off his indictment. And while his information was great, it was mostly about the enemies of the Sinaloa cartel, specifically the Tijuana cartel. In one story, and this incident is backed up by WikiLeaks, The informant tells the DEA that the Tijuana cartel is hiring a trained sniper nicknamed the Monster to shoot DEA agents and frighten them into leaving Tijuana. Well, which, obviously that's a ploy to get the DEA to focus even more on the Tijuana cartel when Sinaloa was trying to take them out during those years. But apparently he also gave some good info on the Belgian Levas while they were fighting Sinaloa. And he does actually sometimes give info on Sinaloa, but never on top people. An academic who studies the cartel sums it up by saying, quote, "The Sinaloa cartel is duping U.S. agencies into fighting its enemies. Typical counterintelligence stuff. It's smart. It's so smart. And who is likely behind all those smart moves? Well, it's probably El Mayo."
Yeah, I feel like Dale should add in that DJ Khaled, "You a genius" soundbite whenever we do an El Mayo 4D chess moment in this show, because there's a few of them, right?
That's a good. I mean, your references from rap have moved up from 2009 to 2017, so we're making progress.
All right, we're getting there.
So the cartel wars, they continue through 2008 and 2009, especially in Sinaloa and Juarez. Massive bloodshed, and the Mexican military, they're also on the attack, and things are going crazy. At the end of 2009, the Sinaloa cartel gets a big win when the top Beltran Leyva brother is gunned down by the Mexican military. Another brother is arrested a couple weeks later. The last brother and the last remnants of the organization merged with the Zetas. But the Beltran Leyvas, basically as a powerful organization, they're done. It's a pretty big win for Sinaloa, especially El Chapo, because again, this was in Sinaloa for the most part. Later that same year, one of the leaders of the Juarez cartel was arrested. And by 2010, U.S. and Mexican officials say that the Sinaloa cartel basically has control of Juarez. Mayo and Chapo, they're emerging as the victors in all this and as the undisputed most powerful cartel in Mexico. Around that time, too, is also when we see the emergence of, Chapo mania in the American media. Forbes lists him on their billionaire list. I forgot which magazine it was. Also, maybe the Times also had him as one of the 100 most powerful people in the world. I remember all these articles about how he was this genius level CEO who treated drug trafficking as basically a Fortune 500 company. And he becomes not only the face of the Sinaloa cartel, but basically the face of drug trafficking in the world, not just in Mexico, but in the world. And, it almost seems like we mention him a ton this episode instead of El Mayo. And it's for good reason. Mayo is a ghost. This time, all times, Information about him and his movements and activities is just that scarce.
Yeah, I feel like that's probably the solid way to run a drug empire. Although not the best way to run a successful podcast, sadly.
One of the only anomalies here is in 2010, where he does an in-person interview with the founder of the largest weekly news magazine in Mexico. He even takes a picture with a journalist for the cover. Some cartel analysts think that he was actually announcing basically his retirement. He had just turned 60 then, but that turns out to not be the case. In the interview, he says the military war against the cartels is foolish because if he goes down, if the others go down, there's just more people to take their place. Quote, "The problem with the narco business is that it involves millions. How do you dominate that?" Zambada said. As for the bosses locked up, dead, or extradited, their replacements are already standing by. He also said the drug war at this point, it's just too little too late because the cartels are so deeply rooted in society now, and there's just too much corruption. He goes on to say the talks of his wealth and high-class lifestyle are foolish, and just to emphasize how he operates, this picture of him on the magazine cover, it's one of only a few pictures of him that exist. Even the DEA guys hunting him down say they have a ton of wiretaps of Chapo just yapping it up, but they don't have any recordings of Amayo's voice and that he doesn't use cell phones ever. There's no slip-ups with him. A Mexican journalist says that if there are top-level meetings of the Sinaloa cartel at this time, with all the heavy hitters, El Mayo wouldn't even say anything. And when he wanted to bring something up, he would walk outside, relay his message to an underling, and that guy would come in and repeat the message. It's just, insane levels of discipline that this guy has.
Yeah, I mean, well, we talked about the nannies and the people setting up the catering, but there is quite a lot of pressure on that underling too, right? Like the world's most dangerous game of Chinese whisperers ever. It's like, you want us to take him out? Yeah, that's what Mayo said, yeah? For a nice bowl of spaghetti, you doofus. And then cue the curb thing. That's my thing.
Are you allowed to say? I never heard Chinese whispers, but I can't. You're definitely going to get canceled for it. I think we called it telephone when I was a kid.
Oh, okay, yeah. I definitely won't mention some cricket.
No, it's good. It could be good. This could finally get you on Rogan, which would be great.
Oh, wicked.
Good for us.
Yeah, I'm not going to get it lifting, am I?
No. By the 2010s, the Sinaloa Cartel is basically a multinational conglomerate. Though it starts off with weed and then coke, this point in time, it really is involved with all drugs and at a global scale. They have operations in basically every drug-producing country in South America, Central America, They're moving tons of drugs into Europe, working with the Ndrangheta and Camorra and various other huge international organized crime groups. They're importing drug precursors and other drugs from Asia. They've also got operations in Africa. I think I even read about a Sinaloan drug lab getting busted in Egypt, of all places. And while they focus primarily on drug trafficking, whereas other cartels seem to expand into, other stuff, they do have their hands in a couple other pots.
Yeah, and just to tee up a show that we'll be doing pretty soon, they're pretty massive over here too, all over the Pacific, like Fiji and New Zealand. They're getting really, really deep into those countries. So yeah, look at
Sinaloa or
Sinaloa specifically.
Sinaloa or oh, interesting.
Yeah, it's nuts.
There's we'll have an update at the end about where they're at right now. There's an interesting research paper from Brookings Institute which goes into detail on how cartels extort people. It mostly focuses on Sinaloa and Jalisco, and it describes the Sinaloa Cartel as pretty professional, even when it comes to that. Like, their guys go in dressed in suits. They take out money payments and even sometimes help the businesses out with keeping away local crime and stuff like that so that the businesses can continue running, whereas Jalisco is a lot more aggressive. And like how they operate and how Mentor operates, a lot more psychopathic, not even caring about these people and if their businesses survive. And when Mayo says they're deeply embedded in Mexican society, he, obviously is 100% right. Like, they employ hundreds of thousands of people, either directly or indirectly. They make up an estimated 5% of the Mexican economy. Sinaloa is probably way more. They actually provide all the services and infrastructure stuff that the government has completely neglected, building churches, hospitals, schools, and they do charity stuff all the time. In 2011, we actually get an alliance between Sinaloa and all the other cartels or whatever's left of them, because the Zetas are deemed too out of control for everyone. They are just rampaging, just too murderous, even for cartels. At this point, though, sooner rather than later, they start falling apart. They're wrecked by infighting. You can go listen to our full-length episode on them that was a couple months back that I think, did you do it or did I do it?
I did one on the CJNG ages ago in El Mencho.
You did Mencho. Yeah, that was a good one. I did Zetas, which was an interesting one. So earlier we talked about how Mayo's son Vicente had been arrested and extradited to the States. That's when we have that phone call from the cold open. According to DEA agents working the case, Mayo tells him, do what you have to do. There's another Mexican journalist who puts the call differently, and basically Vicente tells Mayo they've got us. It's either us or El Chapo, which, easy decision to make. Also, according to the DEA agents, Vicente was telling the DEA that Mayo was getting quite upset with Chapo over the last few years for going out and about and not hiding in the mountains, thinking that Chapo was bringing more heat to himself and the organization. While Chapo had started out conducting himself similar to Mayo with a low-key approach, there's always stories about him, going to fancy restaurants, taking everyone's phone, making sure no one left, and paying for all their dinners at the end when he leaves, just basically being out in the open and not inconspicuous. Some of these sightings are probably nonsense, but some are probably real. And the other thing is that there are no El Mayo sightings, right? He just doesn't exist. After Vicente cuts that deal, the noose starts to tighten around El Chapo with arrests of key lieutenants, and then he gets arrested for the second time in 2014. He escapes from prison in that famous moment in 2015. He's arrested again in 2016 after meeting Sean Penn, which, come on, goofy move, man. After that second escape, you gotta hide out after that.
Yeah, I mean, he and Penn were being a little bit goofy at that point.
Yeah. But you're an international news story. You can you've embarrassed the Mexican government, and you've annoyed the U.S. too. So you might wanna play it cool. They're gonna be gunning for you like never before, no matter the bribes or connections. But if it was Clooney, maybe I'd understand. But Sean Penn, I don't know, man. Although Mystic River fucking owns too. Love that movie.
That's incredible. Tree of Life, He's got some goodies.
Yeah. Or Walton Goggins, love that. By far the better of the Goggins. That guy. I'll take a risk.
Wait, there's a second Goggins. But I don't even know there was one.
Dude, do you know who Walton Goggins is? The dude from Justified?
No, I just know. Wait, he's not. He must
and the
be,
Shields.
He is related to David Goggins, the guy who does the long distance running.
No.
There's two Goggins.
No, dude, he's the best. But yeah, in terms of El Mayo turning on him, I mean, their partnership, it lasted for decades, right? Which is way more than any other cartel alliance or partnership. So I guess that's nice, It's one of those don't cry because it's over, smile because it happened sort of thing, Sean.
Well, I genuinely, because I thought you were talking about David Goggins, so I was like, oh, that must be a David Goggins quote, some inspirational thing, but it's not. There's another Goggins, which is blowing my mind.
That's a thing that like girls used to have for their yearbook quote in the 90s. After El Chapo goes down, we get the rise of Los Chapitos in the cartel, who we've talked about before. There's 4 sons that are involved in the drug game. They're said to be under the protection of El Mayo at first as they start making their presence known within the Sinaloa Cartel. Just, classic Nepo baby stuff. They get off to a bumpy start when in the summer of 2016, 2 of them are kidnapped at a high-class restaurant in Puerto Vallarta, which is in Jalisco New Generation Cartel territory, which is, they're not nice guys. I know we mentioned them a few times before, but just to be clear, they are, at that point, I think the other big national cartel in Mexico. They're led by El Mencho, who Sean did an episode on, and they're just certified lunatics. I mean, I think, eclipse the Zetas in terms of their brutality and the heinous stuff that they do. They're, at that time, the new kids on the block, fairly recent. Sinaloa is the old guard. Why the Chapitos are dining in their territory, I don't know, but, very rich second-generation cartel kids, so probably thought they could get away with anything, and they did not. After being held for several days, just like Sean was sometimes in the basement of a Berlin discoteca, their release is negotiated by El Mayo. We don't know how or why this happens, but there's a wild rumor that he got a hold of El Mencho's family, like one of the members of El Mencho's family, and said, if you don't release them, we're going to kill this person. Which, again, master negotiator move right there. Following El Chapo's extradition to the U.S. in 2017, a top lieutenant for Chapo calls a meeting of Sinaloa heavy hitters, and in a power grab move, ambushes 2 of Los Chapitos and even allegedly El Mayo himself when they get to the meeting location. That was the cold open from the first part of this, which, none of these guys are invincible, but if you're going to go for El Mayo, you got to finish him off because he is not the kind of guy you want to leave mad at you. Only a few months later, that lieutenant is surprisingly captured by the government, and his son even goes so far as to turn himself into U.S. authorities at the border shortly after because he's in so much fear for his life. In 2019, one of the Los Chapitos gets detained. If you guys remember, this was like a huge story and chaotic moment in Sinaloa. The military grabs him in the middle of Culiacan. Within an hour, there's cartel hitmen just going nuts, shooting up everywhere, roadblocks, fires, hundreds of them just rampaging. I think there's tons of videos of this online. It was like happening in real time, They kidnap soldiers. They threaten that they're going to start kidnapping families. The whole thing lasts, I think, nearly a day until the president of Mexico just gives up and orders the release of the captured Chapito. Somehow only 8 people are killed. I think 7 soldiers and 1 civilian, a bunch wounded. But it's a major victory for Los Chapitos. They show off their strength. They're standing up to the government and the military, forcing their hand. Some people think this only happened because El Mayo okayed it and had their back. Others have said that El Mayo actually held his men back and that this eventually leads to a rift between Los Chapitos and Mayo. Again, it's not only like there are differing stories when it comes to a lot of this stuff, but they're just completely on the opposite ends of the spectrum. So where do things stand now with the Sinaloa Cartel and El Mayo? Apparently, Los Chapitos are doing their own thing and aren't aligned with him anymore. Plus, El Chapo's brother controls his own faction of the cartel, and Los Chapitos are getting the scraps with their uncle and with El Mayo's faction. There doesn't appear to be any friction between El Mayo and El Chapo's brother, though. But I guess if there are 3 different factions that are no longer aligned, is it really a cartel anymore, or even a federation, especially if they're warring with each other? It's hard to say. Friend of the show, Luis Chapero, he did a long video talking about this on YouTube, I think fairly recently. And he basically says it doesn't really exist like it once did.
Yeah, I'm pretty keen to get Luis back on the show because he's always putting out amazing stuff on the cartels. But you said it before, right? They're so deeply embedded in society, culture, the economy that they're now just like working fully in legitimate businesses like farming, fishing, textiles, metalworks. They're just the economy in Mexico. There's loads of capos who I'm sure have just completely left the game, and they're building tower blocks in like Jalisco or whatever at this point. It's really, really embedded.
I mean, hotels in Tulum, but it's Miami in the 80s, right? Like, the city was built on
Palermo in the 60s as well, right? Wasn't it 60s or 50s, I think?
So where do we stand with El Mayo? He is 76 years old, which might as well be like, 1,000 years old in the cartel game. Basically, all the other high-level dudes are either dead or in jail by their 30s or 40s. Or sometimes there might be a guy who takes over far later when he's older, but he doesn't last long. In 2009, Mexico actually came out with a top 37 most wanted list. And he's the only guy on that list who has yet to be arrested or killed, which is insane. It's a testament to how powerful and smart he is. I don't think he's even gotten a speeding ticket as far as we know. He's easily the most successful Mexican drug lord of all time. Probably the most successful drug lord of all time, if you think about it, except for maybe one of the Asian meth or heroin kingpins we've covered. So I don't know if he's the richest in terms of like total, but all the others have been killed or arrested, you know, like they're not out there living it up. I can't really think to anyone, like can't think of anyone I think who comes close in terms of being on top for so long and not suffering the consequences. We don't know how much money he has. He's never been in the Forbes list, but that's all, you know, usually just a made up media game, especially when it comes to criminals. They're really just guessing. When his son cut his deal and he was arrested at 35, he forfeited 1.4 billion in assets. So, you know, I assume he's doing well. As for his kids, Vicente's already been let out of jail for, I think, a few years ago. There's recently a leaked photo of him chilling at an airport. He's got another son that was arrested in 2013. And while the federal minimum for what he was arrested for was 10 years, he pled guilty. He got 5.5 years. He's out. His brother, El Rey, who we talked about earlier, got arrested in 2008. He cut a deal and is already out of jail. He's got another son that pled guilty in the U.S. and got 9 years, but I think he'll be out soon. And there's yet another son who's never been convicted. I think he's 41 or 42, and supposedly is now next in line to take over. I don't know. You know, I think it's kind of a power move if you're really that much in charge at this point to have your kids not be involved in the game, instead, you know, living it up in Saint-Tropez or St. Bart's or whatever. But, you know, maybe that's why I'm not a kingpin. And also, much like his famous father, there's really not that much information out there about this son. Does he even exist? Do any of us really exist? What is existence?
Suffering? I mean, it is for me.
Yes. Yes, it is. The DEA also believes that El Mayo is sick with diabetes, and they think that he's still hiding out in the mountains of Sinaloa, much like every other cartel guy ever when they go on the run and the heat is on. He's still as powerful as ever. One Mexican journalist even said that the Ndrangheta, one of the most powerful organized crime groups in the world, who we've done a few episodes on, needs to get a green light from El Mayo before buying drugs in South America. They go on to say that he actually is a stabilizing force in the global drug market. He guarantees a price. He defines a big part of the market. He sets the quality of product. I think right now the U.S. has a $15 million bounty on him, and recently had their 5th or 6th indictment against him. But, you know, who knows exactly what's going on with El Mayo and the U.S. government, because everyone in his family seems to get those super sweetheart deals.
Yeah, that's sweetheart deal. Sounds a little corrupt. Someone needs to check into this guy. Seems pretty sus.
Yeah, it'd be nice to get that bounty. But yeah, till next week. Thank you for bearing with us on this one. Patreon.com/podcast, and you know, go on all the socials and the YouTube and the comments, whatever you have to do to help us.